For the last few months, it seemed like the US position on Russia was softening again. The end of 2025 saw the US propose a 28-point peace plan that, if accepted, would have given Vladimir Putin almost everything he wanted out of the Ukraine war. That plan didn't go anywhere, as Ukraine rejigged the plan and Putin did what he always does: delay. The most recent refusal of peace may have been US President Donald Trump's final straw. Oh, for God's sake. A combination of these peace plan issues and the US's desire to hurt Venezuela has led to an about-face by the US. Teaming with the UK, the US has just crushed Russia without firing a single shot. It all started with a blockade. On December 17th, the Telegraph reported that Trump had announced a blockade affecting all sanctioned oil tankers entering or leaving Venezuela. The move was positioned as an attempt to place pressure on former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, who has since been extracted from his country and placed into custody by the US. Trump's administration declared that Maduro had been using the oil shipped by these tankers to fund Venezuelan drug trafficking and other crimes, as seen in one of Trump's many Truth Social posts. For the theft of our assets and many other reasons, including terrorism, drug smuggling, and human trafficking, the Venezuelan regime has been designated a foreign terrorist organization, Trump declared. Therefore, today I am ordering a total and complete blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers going into and out of Venezuela. The announcement came in the wake of the US having previously seized a sanctioned oil tanker heading from Venezuela to Cuba, and it delivered a message to Maduro that amounted to Trump telling the former Venezuelan president that his days were numbered. However, there was somebody else who heard the message loud and clear: Vladimir Putin. With Russia operating an enormous shadow fleet, which the Telegraph points out was being used to ship oil between Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, any blockade around Venezuela created by the US would mean bad news for Putin. And so it proved to be when US forces located, intercepted, and boarded a pair of Shadow Fleet vessels in the wake of Trump's announcement. America then turned its sights to another Shadow Fleet ship, formerly named the Bella 1, which is when Putin attempted to intervene. That ship, which the US sanctioned in 2024 based on suspicions that it had been used to carry cargo for Hezbollah, didn't go down quietly. Falsely sailing under the Guyanese flag despite not being registered in Guyana, the ship was caught trying to bypass the American blockade. What followed was a 3-week chase that started when the ship's Russian, Ukrainian, and Indian crew ignored an order to stop and instead fled back toward the Atlantic. The US followed. Putin attempted to intervene, but on New Year's Eve, the Telegraph says, Russia relented and added the Bella 1 to the Russian shipping registry. This, the Kremlin calculated, was a sanctuary of last resort, and surely sufficient. Personal ties between Trump and Putin aside, the United States might be expected to give up the pursuit, given that the vessel had turned back before reaching Venezuela, was not carrying oil, and that boarding it risked breaching international law and triggering a diplomatic incident, the Telegraph reports. However, the Kremlin was wrong. Far from giving up the chase, the US continued to try to catch and board the Bella 1, leading to reprimands from the Kremlin. The US didn't care. It was going to take this ship. Even as Russia issued a formal request to the US to stop the chase, the US didn't relent, and finally, the United States caught up, with a little help from its allies in the UK. As Pravda reported on January 7th, UK Defence Secretary John Healey has confirmed that the UK's armed forces supported the US operation to take down the Bella 1, which the outlet says has since been renamed to the Marinera. Healey didn't provide too many details, stating simply that the UK's troops showed skill and professionalism in support of a successful US interception of the vessel Bella 1 while on its way to Russia. However, we do know that Royal Air Force aircraft were involved in the operation, per Pravda. A shot had just been fired across the bow. The US wasn't going to take Russia's begging, cajoling, and threats anymore. Blockade would stand, and it would take any ship that attempted to circumvent America's efforts to ship oil in or out of Venezuela. The capture of Bella 1 showed Putin the US meant business, even if the Russian president believed his relationship with Trump to be warm enough that he could use his influence to prevent Trump from getting in the way of Russian business, and the US wasn't alone. As United 24 media reported on January 7th, the same day that Bella 1 was detained, the US followed up by seizing a second Russian-operated tanker sailing in the Caribbean Sea. Named the MT Sophia, this tanker had no national flag and was operating under US sanctions, the outlet says. Footage published by the US Southern Command shows US forces boarding the Sophia, which was reportedly found to be sailing without proper registration documents. US Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem took to X to announce the capture of both the Bella 1 and the MT Sophia. The world's criminals are on notice. You can run, but you can't hide. We will never relent on our mission to protect the American people and disrupt the funding of narco-terrorism wherever we find it, period, Noam declared in another message that this time seems more aimed at Putin than Maduro. After all, Maduro was already languishing in a jail cell by the time these captures were made. It seems that the US is making sure that Putin knows that Russia's sanctioned Shadow Fleet ships aren't welcome anywhere near Venezuela. Russia's leader took a bruising with these two Shadow Fleet tanker captures. But if you thought there was any chance that his relationship with Trump could salvage the situation, he was in for a rude awakening. On January 8th, both The Independent and Al Jazeera reported that Trump has backed a bill that intends to impose sanctions on countries that buy Russian energy exports. Trump's approval of the bill was reported by one of its co-authors, Senator Lindsey Graham, and it paved the way for the implementation of tariffs that could rise as high as 500%. Trump's approval alone isn't enough to get the bill over the line, of course. It still has to go through the usual channels that any bill would follow to become law. But with Trump giving the green light, what was once seen as a major barrier to the bill passing has been lifted. This bill will allow President Trump to punish those countries who buy cheap Russian oil, fueling Putin's war machine, Al Jazeera reports Graham is stating when announcing Trump's approval. He added, "This bill will give President Trump tremendous leverage against countries like China, India, and Brazil to incentivize them to stop buying cheap Russian oil that provides the financing for Putin's bloodbath against Ukraine." So not only is Putin losing physical Shadow Fleet tankers, if this bill passes into law, he may find himself losing some of his biggest oil customers, who also just happen to be countries that are pumping billions of dollars of oil and gas money into the Russian war coffers. Such a bill would almost certainly have a strong impact. As Euromaidan Press reports, Senator Graham has already highlighted how a 25% tariff employed against India for buying Russian oil led to India reducing its oil imports. A bill that proposes tariffs that are 20 times higher would give both India and China some serious food for thought in terms of whether they believe that the discounted rates they're getting on Russian oil are good enough for them to try to endure the economic hit that the US seems to be preparing. For Russia, the passing of this bill would mean a serious financial blow, assuming that China and India do back away from importing Russian oil. Al Jazeera notes that China accounted for almost half of Russia's crude oil exports in November 2025, with India accounting for 38% of those exports during the same month. The Independent adds that these two countries alone account for around 70% of all Russia's energy exports. This secondary sanctions bill has been around for a long time. The proposed legislation was introduced back in April 2025, and it had bipartisan support from 81 co-sponsors by May 21st, according to Senator Graham's website. Perhaps the only reason that it hadn't been greenlit earlier is that Trump previously believed that he could use his relationship with Putin to bring an end to the war in Ukraine without embroiling the US in what will become a trade war with India and China that is sparked by efforts to punish Russia. However, months of Putin refusing peace deals, followed by his blatant disregard for the US blockade around Venezuela, appear to have pushed Trump over the edge. In the coming weeks or months, it seems likely that the 500% tariff bill is going to be made into law. Of course, you can never be certain with the US. Trump's green light for the bill may be a threat that he's using to bring Putin back to the negotiating table. The UK hasn't been twiddling its thumbs either. Before the capture of the Bella 1, the MT Sophia, and the green lighting of what could be a devastating sanctions bill for Russia, the UK has also made an interesting move designed to take a bite out of Russian liquid natural gas or LNG exports. As Euromaidan Press writes in a January 8th article, Britain announced in November 2025 that it would ban UK companies from providing maritime services, shipping, insurance, maintenance for Russian LNG, with the ban phased in throughout 2026. In other words, as Putin is being forced to wrangle with issues related to captured Shadow Fleet tankers and incoming secondary sanctions, the UK is going to spend 2026 phasing out LNG imports. This move is notable both for the impact it could have on Russian LNG exports to the UK, and due to it being an example of the UK being ahead of the European Union or EU when it comes to cutting these exports out. The EU hasn't taken any equivalent action against Russia's LNG tanker fleet, Euromaidan Press reports, instead favoring a ban on LNG imports that has a deadline of January 2027. A coalition of 40 civil society groups, which includes the likes of Greenpeace and Razom We Stand, has labeled this deadline as being too late, and it may have a point. Russia makes a lot of money from selling LNG to the European Union. On January 8, the Irish Independent reported on an analysis that shows the EU remains reliant on Russian LNG, and that 2026 shows no signs of the EU's imports of this energy product slowing down. The outlet reports that 76.1% of the 19.7 million tons of LNG produced by the Northwest Siberian Yamal project found its way to the EU in 2025. That batch of LNG purchases from a single Russian supplier amounts to 7.2 billion euros, or about $8.39 billion of revenue for Russia's LNG companies, all of which is taxed by the Kremlin. Euromaidan Press also focuses on the Yamal project when examining the EU's continued dependence on Russian LNG. It points to Greenpeace calculating that the Yamal project generated about $40 billion from LNG sales between 2022 and 2024, which the Kremlin was able to tax to the tune of $9.5 billion in profit tax, which is money that has gone straight into Putin's special military operation coffers. That's enough money to fund the creation of 271,000 Shahid drones, Euromaidan Press reports. So it's not too much of a stretch to say that the EU's slow draw away from Russian LNG is playing a part in enabling Putin to maintain his long-range strike strategy against Ukraine. Existing sanctions on Russian LNG have at least had some effect. On December 25th, Reuters reported that Russia has been forced to push back by several years the target it had set to reach 100 million tons of LNG output annually. But again, more could be done. The UK has taken the necessary steps, but the EU is dragging its collective feet. Euromaidan Press points out that the Yamal project relies on 15 specialized Arc 7 ice-breaking tankers, 6 of which are UK-based, and are now subject to the UK's own restrictions. 5 more are operated by a Greek firm named Dynagas, the two nations' contributions adding up to 11 of the 15 Arc 7 tankers that Russia needs. The EU could shut down the majority of Yamal project exports if it took the same action with the Greek tankers as the EU has taken with its own. Russia can't replace those tankers. Sanctions have reduced it to only being able to conduct test runs on an Arc 7 it's trying to build itself. We'll have to wait and see if the EU is brave enough to follow the UK's lead in taking such a bold step when so many of its members still rely on Russian LNG. What the EU does next will be important, but the headline is that the US and UK are both cracking down on Russia's energy exports. In the case of Bella 1, they even worked together to rein in a sanctioned ship. As for Russia, it's gone from bargaining with the US to warning it to outright threatening an escalation that could involve military action if America continues to target Shadow Fleet ships. At least one person is making that threat. On January 7th, United 24 Media reported that First Deputy Head of the Russian State Duma's Defense Committee, Alexei Zaravlyov, had started throwing around threats of Russian military action up to and including a nuclear response. Zaravlyov's comments started on the slightly more reasonable side of the spectrum when it comes to Russia's view of what's happening both to Venezuela and its own Shadow Fleet ships. "We need to provide a military response, attack with torpedoes or sink a couple of American boats," the Duma official said. Speaking about the Bella 1, he added, "This is nothing more than piracy, the seizure of a civilian vessel by the armed US Navy. It's essentially the same as an attack on Russian territory, since the tanker was flying our national flag." Granted, the flying of the flag only came after well over a week of the US chasing the Shadow Fleet ship. But some might argue that Zaravlyov has a point, even if that flying of the Russian flag was being treated as a get-out-of-jail-free card. But Zaravlyov then used his platform to bring talk of nuclear weapons into the discussion. "There is no doubt that we must respond firmly and swiftly. Our military doctrine even envisages the use of nuclear weapons in response to such an attack, especially since, according to available information, a Russian submarine and some other Russian military ships were located somewhere near the vessel," he said. Russian officials aren't strangers to leaning on the nuclear crutch, and it's unclear how much of the statements amount to Zaravlyov's own thoughts and how much is Putin speaking through the mouth of a crony. The one thing that does seem clear is that what the US and UK are doing with the Russian Shadow Fleet and their sanctions has rattled Russia, and that's precisely the point. Putin being shaken up by all of this is what the US and UK seem to have intended, not least because this series of incidents has humiliated Putin and played their part in the beginning of a year that is exposing Putin as being far weaker than he claims. The Telegraph makes that point in its January 7th article, with the outlet's senior foreign correspondent Adrian Blomfield writing, "Ever since coming to power more than a quarter of a century ago, Vladimir Putin has yearned for Washington to treat him as the leader of a great power, an equal of the United States, as it did during the Cold War. Instead, in the wintry waters of the North Atlantic, Mr. Trump has treated Russia as a minnow, swatting aside its president in the most chastening way. That dismissal of Russia has to sting for Putin, especially as the US has already shown how little it respects Putin's attempts to prop up Maduro. We covered the American operation to capture Maduro in a video, along with how that operation might affect Putin going forward. Check out that video for the full story, though the main takeaway is that Maduro's capture minimizes Putin's influence in South America. The US, along with the UK, so openly targeting Shadow Fleet ships now is another shot at the supposed strongman leader, whose armor now has some very visible cracks. The US also hasn't been afraid of telling Putin that it doesn't care about his reactions. January 7th saw Pravda report on comments made by White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt, who seemed to try to toe the line. While reinforcing that Trump and Putin have a good relationship, Leavitt added that Trump has also made clear that detaining sanctioned vessels is the policy of this administration and he's not afraid to implement it. Perhaps this is Trump's way of expressing his frustration over a Ukraine war peace deal not being reached yet. If it is, then the pressure being placed on Putin has backfired, at least for now. That's according to the New York Post, which reported on comments made by Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs regarding an amended 19-point peace plan that the Kremlin has mulled over. The document turned out to be extremely far from a peace settlement. The declaration is not aimed at achieving a lasting peace and security, but rather at continuing the militarization, escalation, and further conflict aggravation, the ministry said. Translation: there will be no peace. Still, the cracks are showing, and Putin is looking weaker now in the context of being a powerful global geopolitical influencer than he has in a long time. The Atlantic Council's John E. Herbst made that point following Maduro's capture in a January 5th article. Herbst said that the capture amounted to the second time that Trump has acted against Russia's interests with impunity, with the first being America's attack on the Iranian nuclear program in June 2025. Whatever fear Putin may have believed that he's created doesn't seem to affect Trump. The detainment of a pair of sanctioned ships, along with the prospect of secondary sanctions, seems to show that the US is willing to tweak Putin's nose whenever it feels like it. And with the UK getting involved, Putin may also be watching other perceived enemies grow more confident in standing up against Russia's leader. Speaking of Iran, Putin doesn't seem to be able to do much about the revolutionary protests occurring throughout the country right now. Russia's weakness is being confirmed as the Iranian regime is teetering close to collapse, which will make Putin's fall from his desired position as one of the world's most influential leaders complete. Find out why in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the US and UK's latest actions against Russia. And thank you as always for watching.